This
We'll get
conference will
started.
now be recorded.
Okay. Um, just to recap quickly, in the last session, we were trying to understand what is the workflow of Git and how exactly it is different from other version controlling system, and why do we call it as a distributed version controlling system. So in Git, everything is a workspace, and every workspace will have a copy of a repository. So that is where you will be able to do all your checkout and check-in your repository, which is called as local repository. However, if you want to share the changes, then you have to have a common workspace or a repository, which is what we call it as a central repository. So the workflow will be you create a copy from the central workspace, do the changes, and first check in into your local workspace, and based on your need you can share it to someone else or you can share it to the central workspace. Okay, so this is where in Git there are two types of repositories. Okay, so one is local repository, the other one is central repository. And we also learned that if we have to manage these two, then in order to work on your local workspace or repository, that is where you are going to use a tool called Git, which is nothing but a Git client. However, if you want to manage the central repository, then we will be using different set of tools which are called as central repository managers. And among them, things like GitHub or GitLab, Gerrit, Bitbucket, all of them will be there. So for your organization to work, you need both a central repository manager in which all the central repositories for each of your project will be there, and for your day-to-day activity you will be installing Git on all of your machines, and using that you will be able to work on the files. Okay. Okay.
Uh, Adam, one question before we proceed for today's session. I was supposed to ask you this question yesterday. Uh, yesterday we discussed regarding a central repository, which is just like a read-only, where if we want to share our piece of code, we are moving there. Does this mean that whenever we are making a production move, we are moving through the central repository only?
Yes, because
And
whatever the changes that we are going to take, regardless
okay,
of whether it is the production or QA, whatever is there in the central repository is what we will always refer to. That is where
so
we make sure that,
so does this mean
yeah,
that production and the central repository, which is the read-only repository, is always they are on sync?
okay. Now, what you need to know is whatever the files that you're storing in a repository, that is a version controlling system, is only a source code, which
Okay.
means these files are in a text format, which is a human readable format. When you say a production or even before going into production, you cannot consume the files which are available directly in it. That is where I told you this point yesterday, that it is called as source code version controlling system, or whatever the files that you're going to put in is called as source code. So what we need to do is, first we have to take the files from this and convert it into a machine understandable file, which is what we call it as an object files or binaries. And that is your final product, which you decide whether to put it into QA or put it into any of the other environment or into your production. So that is where the files that you're going to take will be from this particular location. But which file to take and convert it into a product and where to put, that is what we have to do as part of our release management, because we cannot stop the files to be stored here, because there will be lot of developments and parallel releases will be happening. So every users will be trying to store all the changes with respect to their project and their release into this. But from there, we need to understand which set of files we have to take, and from that create a product, which is what we call it as the build system. And from that you will be generating a deliverable, which is what we call it as a jar or a var or a DLL or a EFT, whatever. Then you have to decide, is it the initial level? Then put it into QA and test it. And once it has been tested, then you will be going ahead with your production. So it is not the source code which goes to the production. It is the deliverable which is getting converted from the source code is what goes to production.
Thank you. And at what point of time we are copying the files and from production to the central repository, which is does this activity taken care by the central manager or like the GitHub or GitLab, whatever is installed by the company?
No, that is more about what you're talking is build management. See,
Okay.
we try to write code and we store it. But after that, there is a system which we call it as build system, in which we need to know how to take it. So this is where why Git is important. Now let's assume I am going to automate the process of build automation, whether I have to give it to QA or later I have to put it into production. So now if I want to generate a product, then for generating the product, I also need the source code. So that is where in my machine, I will use Git, and using that, I will create a copy of the workspace, and I'm not going to do modification. I'm just going to use the file for read-only purpose. So that is where my interest will be only to use the files for read-only permission and convert them. So that is how there will be different people using the workspace in different way. So for build management, you don't need anything to be modified, but still, if you want the files to be available in a machine to do the build of a product or create a product, then again you are going to work on the same way. The difference is, for all of them, you need to have a workspace, and in that workspace you should be able to see the files. Whether you are seeing the files for read-only purpose or whether you are seeing the files for modifying, it's up to the person, or who is the person who is trying to take the repository from the central repository.
Thanks, Adam.
Getting that?
Thanks for clarification.
Okay. So now this is where I was talking about that there are various central repository manager or tools available. Now, for now, let us not go into the central repository managers. Okay. Now assume that in a company, you are a user where there is a project. So if you are interested to work on the project, then you need to know what is the repository for your project. So all you have to do is create a copy of that. So that is where for the next 1 or 2 sessions, we will focus completely on how do you work as a user using the Git client, and how is that you will be able to do the regular version controlling system. Okay, so it's not about the central repository, it's more about as a user, whether you want to take the code for read-only purpose or whether you want to take the files or the code for modification purpose, it's up to us. So that's where when we are focusing here now, how is that I can set up a quick central repository? So that is where you can make use of GitHub, which is free and there's nothing much to set up. But however, when you focus on the central repository manager, then there are a lot of other things we have to focus. So that's where to do this practice, now what we need is we need to create a central repository. So that's what, if we go back to this diagram that we are going to do. So now in this, I need to first create a central repository. So this is where you can just quickly go to github.com. Okay. And if you have your Gmail, just create an account in it. So I've already signed in. Now you will be seeing a lot of other repositories available. Okay. So just like how you create a new Gmail, use your existing Gmail account, go to github.com and try to create a account. Now, once you create an account, you will be coming in, and then on the left hand side, you can just go ahead and click and create a new central repository for you. And that way, for current demo purpose, I'm just using the github.com. Okay, because I don't have to think about anything else for managing the central repository, because we are focusing on how to work on the Git client. So this is where go ahead and create a new repository. And now for this, let me just call it as May 2020. Okay. So the repository name that I'm giving is May 2020. Now this will be typically the product or the project what you're working. Now, there are differences between public and private. Now, by default, anything that you put into GitHub will be public so that everyone can access. So I'll be just going to leave it as it is. And you scroll down, all you have to do is create repository. So that is where it's very easy if you use GitHub for practicing. Now in this, just make a note of this particular content called git ignore. Okay, I'll be talking about this little later. So for now, all I'm doing is make sure you have signed in to GitHub, then click on new repository, and in that give a name for your repository, let it be public repository, and then just come down and click on create. Okay, so what we have done by end of this, we have created a central repository. So now if anyone wants to work, all they have to do is refer to this. So this is what happens most of the time, wherein if your organization is following the continuous development and for which you are going to modify the code or you want to see the product where it is, now this is the path. So make a note of this path, because anytime going forward, if someone asks you where is that you're going to work, now this is the central repo which you are going to refer. Okay, now we have created a central repo, so it was very quick. That's the reason we used GitHub. Now after this, I'm going to forget about it, because using this we are going to manage everything using our machine. So this is like an account that you create in a bank, and after that you don't have to go to account, or you don't have to go to a bank every time, right? So you just use your mobile or your laptop, right? Or you just go to an ATM and just start doing the transaction and access. The same way, now I don't care about GitHub. The only thing I care about is my repository which is available in GitHub. So this is the reference for me. Now this is for central repository. So now if I have to work in my laptop, so this is where I have to install the client, which is nothing but the actual git command. Okay, so like again from the beginning, if you remember, I said server and client, right? So this is your server, and now we need to install git that will be acting as your client. So in my laptop, if I want to install git, so all I have to do is, if you just quickly go ahead and say git download. Now depending on your OS, you will be getting the installation steps. Okay, so whether it's a Linux machine or it's Windows or Mac OS, you're going to install. And especially if you're installing git on Windows, you will be getting an additional command prompt, okay, which is called as git bash. If you are installing in Linux, you don't have to worry. But if you are installing git on Windows, additionally, you are going to get one command prompt like this. Okay, so git will be installed, and in this there will be something called as git bash. Okay, now what is the need of this? The first thing you need to know is this command prompt, whatever that git is giving, is a bash command prompt, which means you can run all the basic Linux commands in this. Okay, so you will feel like you are working on git on a Linux machine, and it's not meant only for Linux. You can use it for any other generic purpose. Okay, but typically if I open a Windows command prompt, in a Windows command prompt, I cannot run my basic Linux commands, right? Because it will not know anything, because it's a Windows command prompt. So that is where if you use this command prompt which git is giving, all your basic Linux works. For those who have worked on some similar tool like Cygwin and others, right? It's exactly like that. So this command prompt of git is giving you a Linux like environment so that you can use this command prompt to work on your regular Linux things that you want. Okay, so most of the sessions I would be using this, because using this I can run all my basic Linux commands. Okay, other than that, once you have installed git, whether it is a Windows command prompt or a bash command prompt, or you have installed git on your Linux, Git is more accessible as a command line utility. Okay, so the only thing is you need to call by commands. Now that is where, if you see, since this is a Linux like environment or a bash shell, I'll be able to run some basic Linux commands in this. So if you go ahead and say which git, you can see it's showing me that git is available in this particular location on my Windows. Even though it's Windows, it's trying to show me as a Linux. So that way I have git installed properly. Okay, now to cross check, you can just say git version, and the version that I have is 2.15. Okay, so by this, what you have made sure that on your laptop or a machine you have git installed. Okay, and you also have a central repository ready for you, so that now using this command prompt I can do all my regular work. Now for this, first I need to choose what is my central repository, which is what I have already created. Okay, so now as you're going to work, before you start your work in Git, there are some basic configurations that you have to do. Okay, now what do you mean by basic configuration, right? So when you actually work on Git, it needs some information like username, email, and other stuffs, which is needed later part when you do commit. So those kind of things you're going to set first. So that is where, as soon as you try to install Git, what you're going to do is you're going to do this basic configuration, and this is nothing related to any of the repository. Okay, and it is one time which we have to do as soon as you connect to the machine or install Git for the first time. So what are those you're going to do? Now, going forward, all I'm going to use is this executable called Git. So this is not a command for information. Command is nothing but executable plus some arguments or options that you're trying to pass is what we call it as commands. Whereas Git is a executable. Okay. So now for this, the very first thing you're going to do is say git config, and then to this you're going to say an option called global, and followed by that you're going to say user.name. Now what is that you're doing here? As it says, it's straightforward. Git config means you're setting some configuration. What do you mean by global? Now, regardless of whatever repositories I'm going to work in my machine, because let's go back to this diagram for a minute. See, I myself can have two workspaces in my machine. So regardless of which workspace I work, I want to set the value common to everything. So that is where in this machine, any point of time, if you refer to user.name, Git will be knowing that it is Adam. So this way in an organization, you're going to give your full name. Then once you have given, the next configuration that you're going to do is git config global user.email. Okay. Now this is where you're going to give the official email of your organization, because if someone wants to reach you to have a discussion with some commit what you have provided, then this is the particular email that they are going to have. So getting it first, so it's going to be your official email. Okay, so now in my case, I'll just go ahead and give my personal ID. Okay, now once these two things are done, there is another configuration which we have to do. I'll tell you why you need it, but as long as right now you're setting, just set it up. I'll tell you why exactly you need it. Okay, now there is another configuration which we call it as git config global, okay, push.default. So these are the three mandatory configurations that we have to set. So now go ahead and take the command prompt and start running it. Okay, and it doesn't matter where you are, just open the command prompt and run it. Okay, so this is what you're going to do. So you have set up something called as username, email, and push.default. Okay, so with this, you are ready to start working on Git. Now, this is where when you say that you want to work on Git, what you need is you need to have a central repository. So that is what we have already created. Now, using this, what we are going to do, we are going to first create a local copy of this workspace. So that is where the first thing, when you want to do your actual work, you need to know what is your central repository, because for every project there will be a separate central repository, right? So for you to work, what is your repository that you need to know? So in our example, we have already created, and this is the central repository that I have, and I have made it as public so that I don't have to worry about any kind of authentication as of now. So to get started, if you want to create your workspace, that is, you're going to create a copy of your workspace, right? Then for that, you're going to use a command called git clone. So as the name says, clone means you're going to make a copy. So for doing a clone, you're going to give two options. The first option is called as the source, which is nothing but your central repo, and your destination is nothing but your local repo. So what it means, you are trying to tell Git to basically create a copy of this central repository and make a folder in your current machine, which is nothing but a workspace, and put everything here as a copy. So that is what it typically trying to tell. So now this is where you need to know where exactly is your central repository, and you need to have permission to access, and based on that you are going to give the location of your central repository. Okay, but when you say the local repository, which is nothing but this copy, now what will Git do? It will try to create a folder in your current machine and make a copy of that. So this is where what you need to understand is you can give your own location in the machine where it is going to put it up. Okay, so if you do not tell anything, then on the same directory where you are working, it is going to create a folder with the name of the central repository. Okay, so for example, if I say git clone, if I don't say anything here, then wherever I am running this, in that same folder, it will be creating another folder called May 2020. Okay, so this is why what I will do is, right now if you see, when you open the command prompt on any machine, by default it will be going to the home directory. Whether it is Linux or Windows, there is a specific directory. So that is where right now it is going to see users. Now instead of that, what I have done in my case is I have created a separate folder, okay, called classroom git. So why I choose this folder? Because for me it's easy to remember. Now this is where I put all the other contents into this for my practice. So at any point of time, if I want to know, hey, where is my repository, I should come here. Because if not, what will happen? Wherever you are in the current folder, it will create a clone. So that is what is the default you need to remember. So now watch this. On my current folder, there are many other contents. Let's not worry, but there is no folder called May 2020. Okay, so here if I go ahead and say git clone without giving any name, you can see it is trying to say that it is cloning. And now if you see, you should have got a new folder called May 2020, which is nothing but your workspace. So whatever you are going to do, you are going to go inside this workspace and start doing the work. Okay, now I can do this way. If not, while creating the clone or making a copy of your workspace, you can give a folder name. Now, for example, if I say create a folder called workspace 00, then what it will do? It will create a new folder called workspace 00 and it is going to make a copy. Okay. Okay. Now, for those, there was a question. Always remember the central repository that you have to create is a common repository which everyone has to access. So that way, if you create a central repository in your laptop, it is only for your practicing. Whether it's an interview or in the organization, you are not going to use, right? So you need to have a common location where everyone can access. So that is where you will be using a separate central repository manager tools like GitLab or GitHub or Gerrit, and you are going to create from there so that everyone can access. Now, coming back, so I can create a folder like this, or if I don't tell anything, it will create a folder with the name of the repository. So this is where, if you go inside the workspace 00, you can see there is nothing available. That is because if you have noted, while cloning, it clearly told that you are cloning a empty repository, right? Because in our central repository, we cloned and there is nothing available on our central repository. So this is only for the first time. But in reality, if you go to an organization, when you try to do a clone, you will get an entire copy of whatever is available from the central repository. Okay, so that is how in real time works. Even for us, for now it is empty, but as we start doing changes and pushing it to the central repository, thereafter if you create a clone, you will be getting everything which is available in the central repository. So that way, in our case, it is completely empty. So now we have to start working. Okay, now this is where, now if I'm a developer and I'm trying to develop some file, what is that I will do? So I will be using the Windows commands or Linux commands and I will generate some file. So let's not worry about generating a file and its content. So for dummy practice purpose, now I need a file. So this is where, now how will you create a file in Windows? So now basically I have to go to a folder, right click and create a text file or a document, right? Now instead of that, in Linux, you will just use a command called touch, or you can say echo some command or output and redirect that to a file. Now that is where I'm using this command prompt, because this command prompts helps me to run the basic Linux commands. Okay, so watch this. All I'm going to do now is I'm just going to say echo first line and redirect it to a file called one.java. So this is where all your basic Linux will come in. Now if you see inside this workspace, we created a file called one.java. Okay, now if at this time, if you want to find out what is the status of your repository, go ahead and execute git status. Now see what happens when I type this. So the first thing that it says is the file that you have called one.java is an untracked file. So this is where, what do you mean by untracked? Recall yesterday what I told you. Now this is a file which is not yet available in the repository, or the repository itself is empty and it doesn't know about any file called one.java. So that is where Git has not tracked this file. So when will Git track? Only when you try to put the file into the repository. So this is what I was explaining you yesterday in this diagram. Okay, so that way, remember, if there is a file which is a new file and not at all available in the repository, then the file will be called as untracked. Okay, now assume that you have done your work, then you have to store this file into the repository. So how do you store? That is where I told you yesterday that if you want to do a check-in, which is nothing but the storing, there is a two-step process. So you cannot just directly take this file and put into repository. So if you go back again to this diagram, I told you that whatever you are working is called as working directory. Now from this, you need to put into a location called staging area. This is where it will take the snapshot and then you will do a commit. So that is where it's a two-step process. And this is what again we were talking about yesterday, that you are going to now take the changes what you have done and put into the staging area so that Git can take the snapshot internally, and from there we will store it into the repository for permanent version. Okay, so this is how there are two steps. So equally there are two commands for that. So the first command is git add. So add means whatever the files you have modified, you are going to add it to the staging area. Now remember, staging area is not a separate folder. It is also available somewhere in the repository and it is virtual. So you will not be able to see the files. So internally what Git will be doing now, whatever the changes you have done, it is going to take a copy. And if you remember, I told you yesterday, it is going to take a snapshot, like a screenshot between the difference what you had earlier and now. And that is what it is going to track continuously. So that way, when you are trying to say git add, whatever is available on your working directory, it is going to take everything and put into the staging area. So now, if you want to tell a file, then you will say git add and the file name. So this will add a single file. However, if you have more than one file, then simply you can also say git add dot, where dot represents in Linux current working directory. So from your current working directory, whatever the files has been modified, everything will be added to the staging area. So now watch this. Now once you have added, if you go ahead and say git status once again, it clearly tells you that it is a new file because it is available in the staging area. And not just that, look at the message what it is saying. So it is clearly telling us we are ready to commit the changes, or it has taken the snapshot. So the next thing what we have to do is go ahead and commit it. So that is what the meaning of changes are ready to be committed. Okay, so when you get this message, you should understand that you have added the files to the staging area and internally the git has taken the snapshot. So now what is the next thing you are going to do? So we are going to take the snapshot and tell git to create a version wherein it will take the information of what is modified using the snapshot, who is modifying, and what is the timestamp it is modifying. All those things put together, it will create something called as a commit ID. Okay, so that's where if you want to do the commit, the next command we are going to use is git commit. But every time when you are doing a commit, I also told you that you are going to give a message. Now this is again, if you go back to this, I was talking about something called as message, and I gave you an example of your bank transaction. When you're doing a transaction, you're going to give a remark, right? The same way, when you're doing a commit, it will take the username from the global configuration we did just some time back. However, it will take the timestamp from the machine, and the details on what got modified, it will take from the snapshot. And that is where we have to pass the message details. So message is nothing but what is the reason that you are trying to do the commit, or if you are actually modifying a file, it is related to a release, correct? So if you are working in the release, then definitely you are part of some sprint, and now in the sprint what is that you are doing? You are working for a epic or a user story or a task. So that way, what the best practice the people will follow is, when you are committing, right, you are going to give a message which will refer for what purpose that you are doing, or which epic you are working, or which Jira ticket on which you are currently working, which will solve this problem, or what is that you are trying to do. So that is where it is more of a meaningful message for us to understand why we are doing this permanent change. Okay, so that's where you're going to give some change. Now let me just call this as first change for dummy release. I can give any message. Okay, so you're going to typically give your message. So now watch this. I'll go to the workspace, and in the workspace I'm going to run this. So what it would have done, now it would have taken the snapshot and stored into the repository. So now if you go back and run git status again, it would say there is nothing to commit and working directory is clean. So the meaning of this is there is no difference between the file that you have here and the content of the repository, which is nothing but the files are unmodified. That is what is the meaning. So this is the very first time you're going to do. But as we start moving, see how the files will be differing, because now the file is not an untracked file because we have stored it into the git. So git now started tracking. So in the tracking, what is it saying? There is no change because both the contents are same. So because of that, the file is called as unmodified. So now with the same workspace, let's go ahead and do another change and see how it is going to work. So in the same file, I will just add another line. Okay. Now, if you see the file, I have added something called as line 2. Now, if you do a git status, what is it saying? First point, it says the file is modified. So what is the meaning? The meaning is now git is saying that the file has been modified because it knows about the file. So first you had only one line, that is what it is stored in the repository, but now you have another line. So it is saying that looks like you have modified file with something. So that is how it will be able to compare with the repository and it will be trying to tell. Okay. Now, second thing that you need to note is it is clearly trying to tell that the files are not yet staged, because if it is a tracked file, first you need to put it into the staging area and then do the commit. So that is what you are going to do regularly. So this way, now if you want to put this into the staging area, then once again you are going to say git add and the file name specifically or dot. So now if I say git status, what is it saying? So it is saying that there is a file which has been modified and it has been added to the staging area and it is ready for commit. So this is how first you go ahead and modify the file and add it to the staging area and then do the commit. But however, there might be scenarios where you might have to modify more than one file. So that is where before I commit this, let me just add another file and show you how exactly it is showing the difference. So this time I'll create another file and I will add this line into this. So now you can see there is another file called 2.java, and in here if I say git status, watch very carefully what it is saying. First it is saying that this is a tracked file and you have modified it. However, there is another file which is completely new and it is not at all available in the repository. Because of that, it is calling it as a untracked file. Okay, and in that, this file changes has been put into the staging area, but this is not yet available in the staging area. So this is where you can go ahead and say git add dot, so that all the changes from your current folder will be put into the staging area. Okay, and now if I say git status, watch the difference. It very clearly now says there is one modified file and there is one new file. and both of them has been added to the staging area. And now both the details together, we are going to give a commit, because commit doesn't mean for every file you have to create a separate transaction. You can also put a copy of multiple files together, and you can also create a commit for a set of changes. So this is how now in the staging area, there is one snapshot which has the modification done on both of the files, or it is tracking both the file changes using one snapshot. So now if I go ahead and say git commit, and again for this I have to give a message. So let's say I will call it as second check-in with set of changes. Okay. And now what we do, this is going to take the changes from the snapshot, and it's going to create a commit ID. So this is where if you go back and say git status, it's being stored. So like this, as a user, what you're going to do is you're going to keep on modifying the files once you have your repository and do the changes, and you're going to do the check-in so that it keeps storing it into the repository. So if you understand now, we have a repository in this folder, but where is the repository? Because if you do ls, all you are seeing is the files. So this is where what you need to understand, the files that whatever you are seeing is nothing but your working directory. But where is the staging area? This is also available inside the repository. But where is that repository? So that is where in the last session I told you, repository will be a hidden folder. So if you check in your current folder, there will be a hidden folder called .git. Okay, now this folder is what is acting as a repository for you, so that whatever the changes that you are doing so far, right, all of them are getting stored here. The staging area is also internally available, the snapshots are also available, and whatever the commit that you did, everything is available. And when we are saying git status, it was trying to compare with the repository and with the files that you have. That is what is called as working directory. So this is how Git was able to modify. But why is it hidden? Because in Linux, if you give a dot, the file or folder is generally going to be hidden. Now, the reason it is hidden, because if you tamper with anything in this, it's a metadata file. Then this folder will not be a Git folder. The folder will be just a regular Windows or Linux folder. So that is where you're not supposed to modify anything here. It is only for the Git's maintenance purpose. Okay, that's why we call it as metadata. So all you are interested is the actual source code or the files which you are going to modify. Okay, so remember this way. So whatever we did now, where did it get stored? It is getting stored in our local repository. So this is what again yesterday I was telling you, every workspace has its own repository. So that way, as a user, any check-in that you're going to do is basically available only in your repository. So this way, if I'm working on it, all the changes or the check-in that I've been doing will be available only here. Okay. Now, your .git folder is the repository. Understand this diagram that I told you yesterday. Every workspace is going to have in Git 3 different sections, right? So this repo is what you are using and you are owning, and whatever the changes you do are getting stored here. Now, what did we do? Typically, we first created a workspace copy for us, and inside that we created some two files and kept on modifying, and we stored it. So that way, yesterday I told you, every time you do a commit, it is going to create a unique ID called commit ID. So that way, those commit IDs are available in your repository. So that is where in the session now, we did commit 2 times. So that means there are 2 transactions or 2 versions or 2 commit IDs available, right? So if you want to see that, then you're going to use a command called git log. So what will log show? See, log is like in your bank, show the mini statement, right? The same way. If you say log, it is going to show you all the commit IDs or the transactions or the check-ins that you have done in your current repository. So what is our current repository? This one, right? The local. So in the local, whatever is available, it is going to show you. So that way, if you go back, okay, now just for understanding, I'll just close all the other command prompts. Okay, so there's only one command prompt. Now here, if I say git log, so do you see that it is trying to give us details about the transaction. So for every transaction, which is nothing but a commit ID, you can see it gives a 40 characters, which is unique. And for every commit ID, you have the owner or the author and the email. So it took both of them from your global configuration. And it has a timestamp, and then it has a message, because as you move forward, what you will be having in the repository, it's full of this commit IDs. So at some point of time, if you want to identify what is the commit ID you did, it's not going to be easy by remembering this number. So that is where you have to give a message which will be helping you to uniquely identify what is the commit you want to find. So like this, for every commit, you are going to get a unique commit ID. Okay. Now, when you're trying to work in git log, you can actually have some other options wherein you can say hyphen and some number like 1, 2, 3, 10. So what is it going to do? So by default, when you run git log, it will always show the commit IDs from the latest commit ID to the oldest commit ID. So if you understand, this was the first commit ID that we created. After that, on top of it, we did some changes for 1.java and 2.java, and we created this. So now watch the output. If I say -1, then from the top, it is going to show you only one commit ID. So this way, now if someone asks you, or if you have to find out what is the latest commit ID on which you are working, just go ahead and say git log -1 and you will be getting it. Because when you are actually working in a repository, there will be hundreds of commit IDs. By mistake also, if you say git log, it will be showing you all the 100 commit IDs. But if you are interested only to see the latest commit IDs, like latest 10 commit IDs or latest 5 commit IDs, then you're going to just give the number. So based on that, it is going to give you only the latest 3 commit IDs or 4 commit IDs, the number what you have given. Okay. So this option will be very handy for you to work. Now, along with this, sometimes giving all the output will not be of your interest. So from the git log, you can also take another option called one line. And now see what the output is. So instead of showing all the details, it will be giving you a short ID for your commit, and then it will just give you only the commit message. So it will not show you the author and the timestamp. So that is where, if you want to quickly refer, you can also use one line. Okay. So both the options are available. Now I can use both of them together. If I say this way, then what will happen? It will show me only one commit ID, which is latest, and that also in the short output. Okay, so that way you can choose the combination of options. And if you want to see the details of a commit, like this is not just the detail. Now I also want to know what and all files got modified. Then you can use an option called git show and then commit ID. Okay, so now watch this. If I want to see the details about this, I can just say git show and the commit ID. So I can take the short ID of the commit, and if I say enter, you can see along with the regular details, it's also going to clearly tell that we have actually added a new file called 2.java, and we have also added a new line in 1.java. So that way, it's going to clearly tell us what are the files that you have got modified. Okay, so git show will give you further information about your commit. Anyway, what is that we did now?
Alan, what is the plus and minus?
Plus means you have typically added a line. So forget about that. See, in the previous version of this file, we didn't have this line. So it is trying to add this line in the current version. So what is that line? It is adding this line. Same way, in the previous version of this, there was nothing. So this is the first time you are creating the file. That is where it is saying it is null. But in the current commit, you are trying to create a file, and in that, this is the first line that you're adding. So plus represents you are adding, minus represents you are removing. And in this is representing the previous version and the current version. So that is how it makes the difference. Okay.
One question I'm having. If we see that the repository, what we are having workspace, next to that in the bracket, there comes one word master.
I'll come to it. We haven't gone into all the other things. There are a lot of things.
Okay. One more question. Why for the 1.java, when we created first time, we are having the state as untracked, then we move it to the repository, commit ID got generated. When second time, when we are making a change to it, why didn't we do the checkout from the repository? We made the change directly there and then stage it to the staging area, and then from there we did the commit. So we could have checkout also from the repository.
No, that is what you need to understand, that you are actually jumping way little ahead on the branching concept. Yes.
Okay, fine.
The question is checkout. Yeah, I haven't done any checkout as of now. There is a reason why I have it done. Okay, I will tell you what is it as we move on to the next, which is the branching concept, and that is where all the head and master you will get it understand. For now, let's forget about all those. You are having a repository, and what we are seeing is how do I commit. So that is what basically we are trying to understand.
Fine, thank you.
Can we possible to do that instead of file? Can we do it in folder?
Okay, you can also add a folder, but like I said yesterday, Git doesn't consider an empty folder. Okay, now for example, if I want, I can go ahead and create a directory called test. But if you try to do status, okay, it will never consider that folder. So even though there is a folder, it's an empty folder. It's not at all considering in the Git status. But watch this. If I create a file inside this, okay, and now if I say Git status, it's going to consider, and it is calling it as untracked because it is a new file. There is nothing that it is available about the repository. So that is where it will consider only the files, not the folders. And again, if I want to add it, I can quickly say git add dot. And now if you look at the status, it will be saying new file, because you see it is not saying directory, it is directly saying the file, and it is already staged. So you're ready to commit. So all you have to do now is git commit -m third checking. And now if you say git log, you would get 3 commit IDs. If I say one line, I'm going to get this. And if I want to see only the first latest commit ID, this is my commit ID. So this is what you're going to do every time you modify, and keep storing it in your local repository. So
and
like
one more
this,
question. You told me that .git folder, right? If I delete that the folder, can we retrieve the data?
You cannot get it back because it's a metadata. The only thing then you have to do is create a new clone. So then you have to follow your process from the beginning. Go back to a different folder, and in that try to do a git clone, and in that you will get a new workspace, and it will also have a complete copy of your repository.
But whatever things we have done, right? We cannot restore all those data, right? After cloning the data, we are doing something in the local repository, and then after that you are deleting the .git folder. Again, you are the git clone. Can we restore the data, whatever we did it done?
No, It's not possible. That is what I'm saying. It is a metadata. So once you have deleted, it's gone. So that is the reason it is hidden. As a user, you should not at all touch. Your work is only to see the files, modify the files, and check in the file. But at any point of time, if you want, you can go ahead and create a new repository by saying clone, and you can start working on that. Okay. I'll show you that also.
Hello. Hello.
Yes.
Adam, you have created one user, git config -- global username and give it colon username. Can we create multiple users at a time?
Okay, this is not a user. This is just a configuration to tell Git that when I'm trying to do a check-in, what is the details. So the process called user creation is not on your workspace. Okay, it is only for a user to access. So all those things comes when you are maintaining your central repository. Here, it is like when you are trying to create a WhatsApp account, you are going to give a number and a name, right? That is what you are trying to do.
Yes.
So this is not a user. It is more about just a reference. When git commit will happen, what are the details it is going to.
Okay. Okay.
Actually, when you are I'm just seeing one message, but upstream has got something during it.
Your voice is not clear actually. Hello. Probably I'm not able to hear you. Can you just put in the chat or hold it for the last?
Hello, Adam sir. Hi, Adam sir. Hello.
Yeah, go ahead. I'm waiting for you.
Sir, yeah. If we are creating under a user all these commit IDs and whatever the changes, can we make a copy of whatever we are making into a file or something like that?
No. See, it's like you have a bank account. You are trying to store every transaction. Can you make a copy? No. The only thing is, if you want, you can make another copy of your central repository, and that will be able to get you all the information. If not, whatever you are doing is getting stored inside your central repository.
Okay, sir.
Can you
Okay.
please go on mute?
Adam,
There's a lot of
Adam,
disturbance.
this is Ruben here. I just have one more doubt. See, so far what you have shown is like installing the Git Bash or working through the Git Bash in the Windows machine. How about if I want to do it in my server end? Like for example, if I'm logged into AWS EC2 or in any GCP instance, how can I do this? Or I might be having a centralized server, whereas I work on that. And how can I do that?
See,
Can I follow
forget
the
about
process?
this word called centralized repository. Regardless of anything, that is a client
Okay.
machine. Okay.
Yeah.
For Git, it is a client machine. So first you need to make sure that you are installing Git, and then whatever the commands we are running, the same thing you are going to run it on your command prompt. Now I am running on a Windows using a bash command prompt which Git is given. If it is Linux, go ahead and directly take a command prompt in Linux, whether it is a AWS server or Azure server, it is a Linux server. It is going to give you a command prompt. So in that command prompt, start running all of them. That's the only difference.
Okay. Okay. Thank you.
I mean, which machine you are working. All it needs is a command prompt. So that is the reason I
Okay.
said it's more of a command driven way.
But do we need any kind of an engine, a Git engine or like a Git client to be installed on the Linux
Yes,
machine or whatever we? Okay.
Git needs to be installed. That is what I told you in the beginning, right?
Okay.
I am using Windows, you have to install. If you are using Linux, then based on the Linux, which version of Linux, go ahead and install Git on it.
Got it.
Yeah, which is important. So you need to install the client on it.
Okay. Okay. Thank you.
Hello, Adam. There is one question from my side. I just want to clear the concept of staging here. I'm just confused in the concept of staging. Can you
Okay,
please revise it in short? Yeah.
guys, all these things I was telling yesterday itself, and I'm requesting if you have questions, stay back. And because we have a lot of other things to cover, I'm not saying I'll not answer, but make a note of the question and stay back so that I can discuss. If you guys are leaving, it will not be possible. Or again, I'm saying that use the WhatsApp group because no one does. But anyway, make a note, and as soon as the session stops, I'll give you some time for question and answer. Please ask me. I'll be able to happily answer you. Okay.
It's okay. Yeah.
So
Thanks.
thanks.
It's better
Now
we will
coming
chat
back,
in the chat box.
yeah, to continue with what I left. See, so far, whatever we did, we are trying to commit and everything is available in our repository, right? Again, I'm first focusing on what do you mean by commit? That is what we are trying to achieve in this. Now here, whatever we stored is available in the repository inside our workspace. So that is where, if you go back to the central repository, you can see there is nothing available. Okay, this is because the changes or the commit whatever you have done is available only in your repository. So this is where once you have completed the work, you are going to share it back to the central repository. Okay, so now when you want to share it back to the central repository, then we are going to use a command called git push. Okay, so what do you mean by git push? Pay close attention. So you are trying to update the central repository with whatever changes that you have done in your local repository. Okay, I'll repeat it. Push means you are sharing the changes whatever you have done in your local repository, and that should not be available in the central repository. So those kind of changes is what you are pushing it to the central repository. Okay, so by that, how are you tracking your changes? Your commit ID. So that is where when you say push, what Git will do is Git will try to take the commit IDs which are not available in the central repository and which are available in your local repository. Only those commits is what is going to be pushed back. Okay, so this is how what you are trying to share between repository is not the files, it is only the transaction details, which is nothing but the commit ID. So at any point of time, once you have done with your work and you want to share it back to the central repository, you are going to say git push. And what will push do? Take all the commit IDs which is not available on the central repository and which is available only in your repository, it will push. So now coming back to our example, in our workspace, there is 3 commit IDs and this is not available in the central repository, right? So that's when, if you say git push, what happens is it will take all the 3 commit IDs that you have and it is going to push to the central repository. And now what it is trying to do, it is trying to connect to the central repository. Okay, so that is where it knows that it is available in GitHub. Now how it knows, I'll show you. Now it is trying to connect to our central repository, and in that we have a username and password, so it is trying to push the changes. So this is where you have to give a username and password. Now this is only for your GitHub. However, you can also set up a password less using some SSH configuration or a key. Now all those things comes as part of your administration in the central repository. Okay, so right now go ahead and give your GitHub account details. Now what it has done, it is actually connecting to the central repository and it has pushed some changes. Now because of that, if you now go back to central repository and refresh this, you will be seeing that the files are there, and correspondingly if you look at this, you are going to have 3 commit IDs. So this is how going forward on a regular workflow, you are going to modify, create a commit and share that commit to the central repository. Now if I go back and if I do a push once again, see what happens. Now, it'll again ask you password. Now, what did it say? Did you note? It is saying that everything is up to date. Okay. So this is where, what is it doing? So when you say push, push is nothing but sharing the commit IDs from your repository back to the central repository, and only those commit IDs which are not there. So as of now, it is saying that your repository is exactly equivalent to central repository. So this is how, as you start working, you're going to share some changes. Okay. Now, if the question comes is, how did it know what is the central repository that it has to take? So whenever we do a clone, right, inside your .git folder, there will be a file called config, and in this, it is going to store all the details, and this is where it is going to refer. Okay. And not just this, the option that you have set up called as push.default is simple. So when you put that, and whenever you say push, it will try to read this file, take your default repository, and it will always push to the default repository. So that is where, by setting that, most of the time it will be working easy for you. So you don't have to tell where is your repository or where exactly you have to put. By default, if you say push, your interest is to push back to the central repository from where you created the clone or copied it. Okay, so that's how git push works.
And please repeat this one once again with the cat git confirm command, please.
You don't have to use it, but just for understanding purpose, I'm saying, when you say git push, how does it know where is the central repository available? So if you have set your options in the global configuration for push.default is simple, the git will know that inside your repository, that is .git folder, there will be a file called config, and in that there will be a reference. So it knows that, okay, you mean to say the push default is simple. So simple method is, I will come and read this file, and whenever you say push, I will always push to this repository. So that is where all you have to say is git push, nothing else, so that it will know what is the central repository where it has to push, because this is the central repository from which you made a copy. So you're obviously going to push it back only to that repository.
So Adam, is simple is a reserve word for this?
Sorry?
And the word simple in the git push, when we say default is simple, is a simple is a reserve word, or it can be any statement what you give?
Yeah, we also have a couple of others. Now for that advanced, let me not go ahead, but simple means by default, you're going to push to the default repository from which it is created, and it is a reserved word. You cannot put anything. But however, what are the different things? So that is where we need to know the branching, so that when I talk about branching, I will tell what are the different things that you will do with push.
Okay, fine. Thank you.
Okay. So now we understood.
Adam Premier. See, while pushing, I don't want to push into master. I want to push into slaves. I want to create a separate folder instead of master. Can that be possible?
What do you mean by slave here? So first of all, what you need to understand is.
I'm not talking about slave. I create one more folder, May 2020. Instead of putting into the master folder, I want to create.
What do you mean by master folder?
So while pushing, mentioning master, right? It's going to master, right?
Okay, I think I need to understand it later. But for now, there is a different concept. See, if you're talking about a branch or a word called master, there is a different concept.
I'm not talking about any branches or what other concept. See, now you are pushing something in that it's mentioned as a master. Can you
okay, forget about what it is mentioning about master. I will come back to it little later. Okay, that is where I'm saying there are too many things. It's not possible to explain everything, but I'm trying to break it up slowly. As of now, what you need to know is there is one repository here, which is nothing but a copy of your central repository. So whenever you say push, you are going to push it back to the repository. That's it.
That's what.
Okay.
While pushing, I don't want to put it to the same directory. I want to put it to some other directory. That's my question.
When you say directory, are you talking about a different workspace?
Different
Hello.
workspace in the master
Hello.
server. Yes.
Hello.
If that is the question, we will talk about it little later. Guys, 1 minute. Okay, now that is what I'm saying. All the scenarios I can cover, provided there are a lot of other things. For now, I'm trying to explain you the basic workflow so that we can move into all the advanced things as we go on. So as of now, understand that when I'm trying to push, we have set it as simple. The meaning of that is it will always go back to the central repository from which you created. That is where on
Hello.
the advanced level, you need to know the other things. I'll come back to it.
Can you please ask questions in the after the ending of the session, please?
No, it will not be relevant if I ask you ending of a session.
It's okay.
Then how
I'll be there.
the flow is getting disturbed? No, the flow is getting disturbed. Please.
Some of the
Let's
questions are irrelevant.
get into the discussion now. Okay. I'll be there after some time so that if you have any questions, let's discuss there. Okay. And if you still feel that the question is not answered, feel free to use the WhatsApp group. Again, I don't want to get into discussion as of now. Please feel free to ask questions any point of time later related to anything. Okay. It doesn't matter. But I'll answer all the questions. So wait for some more time. You will be getting all your questions answered. Now, just quickly to repeat what I was trying to tell. What I'm trying to tell you is how do you create a workspace, how do you modify, and how do you store it back. So follow with that, then we will see the remaining things. So as of now, whatever the changes you are pushing, we are pushing it only to the central repository because that is what I want to push it always. Now, like us, there will be many other people also working. So that is where what I did now in my machine, I installed Git and we went ahead and did a clone and I modified and pushed. So now assume there is another user who wants to do. Then what he will do, he will also install Git on his machine, set up these details for him, and then he needs to do a Git clone. Correct? So that is where he will be starting his work, where he will be having a workspace in his machine. So that is how I myself can have another workspace, or there will be another user who can also make a clone of that. So that way, just to show you, let me take another command prompt as if like I'm a different user on a different machine. Okay. Now I will go to my same directory. Now here what I will do, this is where now here I will say workspace 01. Okay. So what did I do now? You can see along with workspace 00, I created a new workspace. So every time you do a clone and give a new folder, it's going to create a new workspace for you. And now watch this. If I go inside this, what do you mean by clone? Whatever is available in the central repository, you are making an entire copy. That is what is called as clone. So that is where until now, whatever is available in the repository, you will also get a complete copy of a repository, all the commit IDs, and corresponding to that, the files. So that is where you are able to see the files, and along with it, if you go ahead and say git log, you can also see that everything is same. Because just to quickly see, we created a clone first, created 3 commits, pushed it to the central repository. From there, I created a new copy of a workspace. So I have everything available. So this is how all of us are going to create our own clone of the workspace and we'll be doing our work. Okay. And now if I modify anything and I store, it is going to be available only in this repository because every workspace has its own repository. So this is how every user is free to modify whatever he needs and it will be available only in his repository. So now watch this. I'm going to the second screen. This is where the workspace 1 is available. So here, let us do some change. Okay. Now quickly what I'll do, I'll try to create a file called file 4. Now once again, if you see the status, it is untracked because there is no such file. I will add and I will commit. Okay, so now what did we do? We added a new commit. So because of that, if I say git log, you can see there is a new commit ID available. So where is this new commit ID available? Only in our workspace 1, which is nothing but this workspace. So like this, every user that he modifies and check in will be available only in his workspace. So now, if this user wants to share the changes to central repository, what is he going to do? He is again going to do a git push. So this is where if you have mentioned the push.default is simple, you don't have to worry about anything. As soon as you enter, it will connect to the central repository. And now what it is going to do, it is not going to push all the commit IDs because in the central repository, you already have these 3. The only thing it will do is it will push only this commit ID. So watch this.
Adam, here the IDs are not correct. @gmail.com. So
Yeah, I saw that. Thank you. Okay, so if you watch, it's clearly going to tell you it is trying to change and update only the commit IDs after this ADDD. If you watch this, ADDD is what we had, and top of that, it is pushing A57. Okay, so that now, if you go to the central repository and if you refresh, you will see the latest commit ID. Okay, so this is how, whenever you say push, what it is going to share is only the commit IDs which is not available in the central repository. Okay, so in this way, if you want to work, first find out what is your central repository and go to your machine and using the git client, do a git clone, get the workspace, modify, commit, and then push it to the central repository. Now, this is what you're going to do. But what if, let me go to my first workspace, or as this user, if I come to this workspace, that is the old workspace, do you see this? The files are still old because the commit ID what we have is still old. Why? Because whatever the commit that we had, we actually stored in the second repository and we pushed it to the central repository. So that way, only the central repository got updated because we did the push there. So what should this guy do now? This is where on a day-to-day basis when you are working, you want to update your workspace also. So it is not that always you will be pushing. You will always try to update your workspace and then you have to do the push. So that is when, if you want to update your current workspace, then you should be doing the opposite of push, which is what we call it as pull. Okay. So what do you mean by pull? Opposite of push. So what do you mean by opposite of push? You are not trying to push the changes which is not available on the central repository, but it is the reverse. That is, now pull means whatever the commit ID which is not available in your repository and it is available in the central repository, you are going to take that to your repository. So that way, now if I do pull, what will happen? In the central repository, there are 4 commit IDs, correct? And this is what we don't have. So when I do pull from this workspace, it is going to download only those commit IDs which is not available in my workspace. So that is where
Which means
whenever
it will get only incremental data.
yes, that is what I meant by push and pull, because I mentioned clearly that push means only that is not available is what you are pushing. The same way, you already have all the commit IDs. So only that which is not available in your repository, if you say pull, it is going to update. Okay, you can see. And now because of that, if I say git log, you can see it has taken the latest commit ID, and corresponding to it, you will be able to see the files. Okay, so this is how on a day-to-day basis, what you are going to do is, for your work, you are going to first find out which is your repository from which you want to work, and from that you install git on your any machine which is called as client machine. And again, for this you don't have to worry whether this is available in GitHub or GitLab or Bitbucket. Take a machine, install git on that machine, try to do a clone, and you will be getting the complete copy as a folder. Now go inside this. If you want to just see the file, that is fine. But if you want to modify, go ahead and modify. And if you want to add, you're going to say git add first, so that it creates a snapshot. And from this, you're going to say git commit, so that it is going to store it as a commit ID. And then you're going to push it to the central repository. So that way, by default, when you say push, it is going to the central repository from which you have created. And the same way, when you say pull, by default, it will be picking up from the central repository. Because as of now, we are not worried about any other repository, because what we are doing, we want to share it is the central location so that everyone can take, or QA can take, or anyone else wants to take. So that's where this is your regular workflow, which is what we call it as a developer or a user workflow.
Adam, I have
okay,
a question here.
Clear until this now?
Adam, I have one question regarding the push git push.
Yes.
Let's say we are making we are having a program where we are making a change. We made a change in our local repository, then move it to staging area, then from there we commit, and that goes to the repository. Still, we have not
Yes.
done the push to moving to central repository. Again, we are making a change and moving to staging area, and then doing commit, and it comes to the repository. So will there be two different commit IDs for the same program will be existing in the repository?
No, commits will be added on top of that, because that is what we did in our case also, right? What did we do first? I created one file and one commit, and did I push it? No. We went ahead and added another commit. So in my local repository, it added on top of this as another commit ID. And then with these two commit IDs, we did a push. So that is where until you push, every commit ID will be stacked on top of it, what you are trying to work, just like a bank transaction. Everything will be on top of existing. So you can continue, keep doing the changes, and all the commit will be stored in your repository.
So does this mean that whenever we are making changes to a program multiple times, multiple commit IDs will be there, and when we do the push to the central repository, all the commit IDs which are not present in the central repository, irrespective of the let's say it is for the same program, that will get moved to the central repository?
Yes, correct.
Okay. So when we did the pull, all the things will come to our local repository, then we can make the changes whatever are required.
No, see again, you are not going back to the basics what I said. Pull means it will not take everything from the central. So it is exactly opposite of push.
The pull will take the difference, the commit ID which are there in central repository but not in the local. Only those will get pulled to the local repository, and there we can work.
Yeah, so the other name for pull is what we call it as update. So if you're using Subversion or Purpose or any other tool, you do something called as update. What do you mean by that? With the existing files, you are updating with the latest, or you are syncing with the latest of the repository. That's exactly what we do in Git pull. Pull means update your repository with whatever is there in the central repository. Okay. Now, this is a generic workflow. Anyway, now before we move into the next topic, what we need to understand, I'll just give you a highlight of what we are going to do tomorrow. We are actually trying to push from our local repository to the central repository. Now, this is where there is actually another layer in it, which is what we call it as branching. Because there is a meaning of what do you mean by branch, because all the changes that you're storing is actually going to get into the branch, and that is what is actually going to help us in doing the parallel development. So in the Git I was talking about this. So that is where now with this workflow, tomorrow we will try to understand what exactly is that branch, and whatever branch you are trying to use, every time if you are going to follow the workflow, this is what you're going to do. So clone, get your repository, modify, add it to the repository, and then push it, and whenever you want, you're going to pull. Okay, so this is what we generally call it as the user workflow. Now with this, we will have to understand what are the different workflows we have, what are the different concepts we have, how do you say whether to push to one repository or to another repository, or what do you mean by checkout, how do you do parallel development, how do you manage everything, is what we have to learn one by one. But for all of them, this is the basic. Okay, so that when I complete tomorrow on what is branch, you will be able to know why we are doing it, where exactly it is storing. Because for now, what I want you to take away is there is a central repository, there's a local repository, make a clone of it, and in your local repository, modify, add, commit, and all the commit IDs will be available in your local. Whenever you want, you're going to do a push, and that will store it to the central repository. Same way, when you want to update your workspace, go ahead and do a git pull. Okay,